The rain had been falling since sundown. Marcus Webb sat in his old wooden chair by the fireplace, turning a broken radio dial back and forth without really trying to fix it. That was how most of his evenings went these days. Not doing much. Just existing. The fire crackled softly, the clock on the wall ticked slowly, and the whole house smelled like pine wood and cold air leaking through the window frames. It was a quiet life. Marcus had chosen it that way. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, with gray creeping into his dark hair and tired lines around his eyes that had not been there 5 years ago. He had spent 20 years as an aerospace engineer, designing communication systems for deep space research programs. Smart work, important work, work he had loved. Then his wife, Elena, passed away. And after that, the work stopped meaning what it used to. He sold the city apartment, bought a small house on the edge of a Colorado valley, surrounded by pine trees and open fields and absolutely nothing interesting. He grew vegetables he barely ate. He read books he barely finished. And he kept Ranger, a 10-year-old golden retriever with a graying muzzle, soft brown eyes, and the gentle personality of someone who had decided long ago that life was simply good. Ranger was the best part of Marcus's days, probably the only part that felt fully real. Which was why, at 10:30 on that rainy Thursday night, Marcus looked up from his broken radio and realized something was wrong. Ranger was not in the room. Marcus set the radio down slowly. He looked toward the hallway. The dog's bed near the kitchen door was empty. The back door, at which Marcus always kept firmly latched, was not fully closed. A thin line of cold, wet air was pushing through the gap. Marcus stood up. He walked to the kitchen, pulled the door open, and looked out into the dark, rainy yard. Ranger was sitting on the porch steps, soaking completely wet, tail wagging low and slow. His ears were relaxed. His posture said everything was perfectly fine. He looked up at Marcus with that familiar expression, the one that always seemed to say, "I did something, and I think you will agree it was the right call." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he looked past him. There was someone on the bottom step, small, sitting hunched with both arms wrapped around bent knees, wearing something that looked like a suit made of thin silver material, though large sections of it were torn and burned at the edges, and the figure was trembling, not just from cold, but from something deeper, something that looked like fear that had been running for a very long time and had only just stopped. Marcus's first instinct was practical. A lost child, a hiker, someone in trouble. He stepped out onto the porch. The rain was steady and cold. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "Are you okay?" The figure looked up. Marcus went completely still. The face looking at him was young, maybe 12, maybe 13, with sharp, delicate features and pale skin that was not quite the right color. Not unhealthy pale, simply different pale, like the inside of a shell. Her hair was dark and matted flat against her face from the rain. Her nose and jaw were structured almost like a human child's, but not quite. The proportions were slightly off in a way that Marcus's brain noticed, but could not immediately explain. Then she blinked, and he understood why. Her eyes were completely silver, not gray, not light blue. Silver like polished metal, with no visible pupil at all. And along her neck, just under the jawline, there was a faint pulse of soft blue light moving beneath her skin, rhythmic, like a second heartbeat. Marcus did not move. He did not speak. The girl looked at him for a long second. Then she looked down at Ranger. Her grip on her own knees loosened slightly, and one trembling hand reached out and found the top of Ranger's wet head. Ranger leaned into it without hesitation. The blue light under her skin slowed down a little. Marcus let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He was an engineer. His mind worked in systems and logic. He was already running through explanations, elaborate costume, some kind of rare medical condition, a film production somewhere nearby. Every explanation felt thin before he even finished building it. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that there was a frightened child sitting in the rain on his steps, and his dog had apparently decided she needed help. "Come inside," Marcus said quietly. She did not understand the words, but she understood his tone, and she understood Ranger standing up and walking calmly toward the open door. She rose carefully, unsteady on her feet, and followed the dog inside. Marcus closed the door behind them both. He got a dry blanket from the hall closet and held it out toward her slowly, the way you would approach something that might run. She studied it for a moment. Then she took it and wrapped it around her shoulders, watching him with those silver eyes the entire time. Ranger circled once and lay down at her feet. Marcus pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and sat down across from her. He folded his hands together and looked at this small, strange, frightened visitor who had arrived in the rain behind his dog. "All right," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "All right." He reached for a notepad and a pen from the counter. Outside, the rain continued falling. But Marcus had a feeling, deep and certain, in the way only a few feelings in his life had ever been, that the quiet life he had been living had just ended. He drew a small circle on the notepad, then a larger one around it, then a dot somewhere far from both. And he turned the notepad around and slid it across the table toward her. She looked at the drawing. Then she looked at him. Then she reached out, took the pen from his hand, and drew something that made Marcus's engineering mind go completely and utterly silent. It was not any solar system he had ever seen in any textbook or database in his entire career. It was far. And somewhere above the Colorado Valley, moving slow and silent behind the thick clouds and the rain, something massive and dark had stopped drifting. It was searching. The first night was the hardest. Marcus gave the girl the spare bedroom, the one that still had Elena's old quilt folded at the foot of the bed, and a small lamp that gave off warm yellow light. He brought her a glass of water and a plate with plain bread and an apple, setting it on the bedside table carefully. She watched every movement he made with those silver eyes, still and alert, like someone who had learned that watching closely was how you stayed safe. Ranger walked in behind Marcus, turned 2 circles on the rug beside the bed, and lay down. The girl looked at the dog, then at Marcus, then back at the dog. Something in her shoulders dropped half an inch. Marcus pointed to himself. "Marcus," he said slowly. She blinked. He said it again. "Marcus." She studied his mouth for a moment. Then, in a voice that was soft and slightly layered, like 2 tones speaking at the same time, she said something that was not a word in any language Marcus knew. It was musical and low, with a small clicking sound at the end. He tried to repeat it. He failed completely. She almost smiled. It was very small and very quick, but it was there. And he pointed at the dog. "Ranger." She looked down at him. "Ranger," she said carefully. Each letter separate, like she was handling something fragile. Then she said it again, smoother this time. "Ranger." Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor without him even opening his eyes. Marcus pointed at her and raised his eyebrows in a question. She understood. She pressed one hand to her own chest and said something with 3 tones in it. A sound that rose, then fell, then rose again, like a small wave. Marcus could not say it correctly. He tried twice, and she tilted her head both times with an expression that suggested he was doing something slightly wrong, but she appreciated the effort. He grabbed the notepad from his pocket and wrote down the sounds as best as he could. Then he looked at her and said, "Nova." She looked at the word. She looked at him. He pointed at her again. "Nova." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, a very human gesture which told Marcus that she had been watching people for longer than just tonight. "Nova," she said, and that was her name from that moment on. Over the following 3 days, Marcus's house transformed into the strangest classroom on Earth. Nova learned fast, faster than felt possible. Marcus would say a word while pointing at an object, and by the second time she heard it, she had it stored. By the third time, she was using it in context. She moved through his bookshelf like someone who was hungry, pulling out titles and turning pages slowly, running her fingers along the lines of text with deep concentration. But what truly accelerated everything was the television. Marcus owned one old flat screen in the living room that he rarely turned on. On the second morning, more out of distraction than intention, he switched on a nature documentary series, the kind with calm narration over wide footage of oceans and forests. Nova sat cross-legged on the floor in front of it and did not move for 4 hours. She watched the ocean episodes 3 times. By the end of the second day, she was forming short sentences. By the end of the third, she was asking questions. Her first real question was about Ranger. She had been watching him sleep in a patch of afternoon sunlight, her small notebook open on her knee. She had been drawing careful pictures of him from different angles, studying him like a subject of research. She looked up at Marcus and said, slowly but clearly, "He is not afraid of me." "No," Marcus said. He never was." She thought about that. "Why?" Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Ranger doesn't work the way people do. He doesn't think about what you look like or where you're from. He just decides whether you're good or not. First few seconds. That's it." Nova looked back at the sleeping dog. "How does he decide?" "I have no idea," Marcus said honestly, "but he's never been wrong." She wrote something in her notebook. Then she said quietly, "On my world, animals do not do this. They work. They stay away. They do not choose." She paused, searching for the right words. "They do not want to be near you." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That sounds lonely." Nova did not answer right away. She looked at Ranger again, at the slow rise and fall of his side in the warm sunlight. "Yes," she said finally. I think it is." Marcus kept the house dark at night. Nova's bioluminescence, the soft blue light that pulsed beneath her skin, grew brighter when she was stressed or frightened, and while the nearest neighbor was 2 miles down the road, Marcus was not taking chances. He taped dark fabric over the bedroom window and kept the curtains drawn after sunset. He had not called anyone, had not driven into town, had not searched anything on his laptop that might raise a flag somewhere. He was not sure exactly what he was protecting her from, but he had seen that massive dark shape moving through the clouds on the first night, and it had not felt like rescue. Nova never talked about it directly. But sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, she would go very still and her eyes would shift toward the window, and the blue light under her skin would pulse a little faster. Then she would breathe slowly, look back at Marcus, and continue talking as though nothing had happened. Marcus noticed every time. He never said anything. Trust, he had learned a long time ago, was not built with questions. It was built with patience. On the 4th night, everything changed. Marcus was in the back room sorting through old equipment when he heard Nova call his name. Not loudly. She almost never raised her voice, but with a sharpness in it that pulled him to his feet immediately. He walked to the living room. She was crouched beside the old radio on the shelf, the one Marcus had been half-fixing for weeks. Her hands were hovering near the tuning dial without touching it, and her expression was something Marcus had not seen on her face before. It was not fear exactly. It was the look of someone who has just heard something they already knew was coming, but had hoped would not. "Nova," Marcus said carefully. "What is it?" She straightened slowly. The blue light along her jaw was pulsing fast. She turned to look at him, and when she spoke, her English was the clearest it had ever been, every word sitting flat and serious in the quiet room. "They are not coming to bring me home," she said. "They are here because of what I saw." The radio behind her hissed softly with empty static. Ranger stood up from the floor, fully awake, staring at the window. Outside, the Colorado night was perfectly silent. That was the part that bothered Marcus most. Marcus pulled a chair close and sat down. He did not rush her. He did not pepper her with questions. He simply folded his hands on the kitchen table and waited, the way he had learned to wait over the past 4 days, quietly, steadily, without pressure. Nova stood by the window for a long moment, her arms crossed over her chest, the blue light under her skin moving in slow, uneven pulses. Ranger walked to her side and pressed his head against her leg. She looked down at him. The pulses slowed a little. Then she sat down across from Marcus and began to talk. Her people were called the Valith. She explained this carefully, drawing the word on the notepad first, so Marcus could see its shape before hearing it. They were not a young civilization. They had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, long before humans had figured out that the Earth was not the center of everything. And the Valith were part of a much larger structure, a coalition of civilizations spread across dozens of star systems, all connected by shared law, shared communication, and shared history. Nova called it the Concord. More than 60 species, thousands of years old, organized, powerful, and very serious about maintaining order across the galaxy. Marcus listened without interrupting. Earth, Nova explained, was known to the Concord, had been known for a long time. But humanity was not a member. Humanity was not even close to being considered for membership. By official Concord classification, Earth was a restricted observation world, a planet whose inhabitants were too young, too unpredictable, and too emotionally complex to be contacted directly. In simple terms, the Concord had decided that humans were not ready. They were being watched from a distance, studied, noted, but never approached. Marcus absorbed this without expression. Then he said, "So we are someone else's science project." Nova looked at him carefully. "More like a world that everyone watches, but no one touches, like something behind glass." "And nobody asked us," Marcus said. "No," Nova said. "Nobody asked you." There was a short silence. "All right," Marcus said. "Keep going." 3 weeks ago, Nova had been part of a youth expedition. The Valith sent young students on supervised survey missions, educational journeys through mapped regions of the galaxy, observing star systems and civilizations from safe distances. It was considered an important part of growing up among her people. See the universe. Understand your place in it. Nova had been on her second such expedition. The 12 students, 4 adult supervisors, 1 research vessel. The route had taken them through the outer edges of the human solar system, far beyond Pluto, well outside any range that human instruments could detect. It was supposed to be a routine pass. Nova had always been curious in ways that got her into trouble. While the rest of the students were in the observation hall under supervisor watch, she had slipped away to a secondary communication room, a quieter space used for receiving long-range transmissions. She had done it before on the previous expedition. She liked listening to the deep signals, liked the feeling of hearing how vast everything was. That night, she intercepted something she was never supposed to hear. It was not a public channel, and it was an encrypted line between 2 senior Concord officials, the kind of transmission that required high-level clearance to access and was never meant to reach the ears of a student. But the encryption had a small gap, and Nova was better with communication systems than anyone her age had a right to be. She listened. What she heard had a name. The officials called it the quieting. Marcus went very still. Nova explained it slowly, making sure each piece was clear before moving to the next. The quieting was not a war. There were no weapons involved, no invasion planned. It was something much quieter and much more calculated than that. For decades, certain senior members of the Concord had been running a hidden operation designed to ensure that humanity never developed the ability to travel between stars. Not because humans were dangerous, not because they were hated, but because they were unpredictable. because the Concorde's models could not calculate what humanity would do once it reached other worlds. And the Concorde, above all things, valued control over the unknown, so they managed it. Satellites carrying important research data were subtly disrupted. Deep space signals that might have pointed human scientists toward real breakthroughs were quietly corrupted before they reached their destinations. Certain research programs that were getting too close to genuine discoveries received anonymous funding cuts through untraceable channels. And in a small number of cases, Nova said, looking directly at Marcus, specific individuals whose work was advancing too quickly were removed from their positions, their research buried, and their findings discredited. Marcus thought about that for a long moment. He thought about colleagues over the years whose projects had collapsed without clear reason, brilliant people who had simply hit walls that should not have been there. He had always assumed it was politics, funding, bad luck. He looked at Nova. How long has this been happening? The transmission mentioned 40 of your years, she said. At least. The kitchen was very quiet. Marcus stood up slowly and walked to the counter. He poured himself a glass of water and stood there looking at nothing for a moment. 40 years. An entire generation of human scientific progress, quietly and carefully held back. He turned around. You said they are here because of what you saw. That means someone on that ship reported what you heard. Nova nodded. The transmission was flagged the moment I accessed it. I did not know that at the time. Within 1 hour, the vessel was struck. The supervisors said it was a navigation failure. Her silver eyes stayed level. It was not a navigation failure. You got out. The emergency pods released automatically when the main systems failed. I reached mine before the others could find me. She paused. I do not know what happened to the rest of the students. Her voice stayed steady when she said it. But the blue light along her collarbone pulsed sharply, just once, and Marcus understood exactly what that meant. She was carrying that. She had been carrying it since the moment she landed. He sat back down. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply looked at her steadily and said, It was not your fault. She did not respond to that. Not yet. But she heard it. Can you prove any of this? Marcus asked. Nova reached into a small hidden layer of her silver suit, a thin inner pocket along the left side that Marcus had not known was there. She placed a small object on the table between them. It was roughly the size of a coin, perfectly clear, with faint geometric patterns inside it that caught the kitchen light and scattered it in ways that made no physical sense for something that small. A data chip, she said. I grabbed it when I ran. It contains fragments of the transmission, not everything. The full recording was on the main system. She looked at it. But enough. Enough to show what the quieting is. Enough to show names. Marcus looked at the chip for a long time without touching it. Then he looked at Ranger, who was lying in the corner chewing the end of his own tail with great satisfaction, completely unbothered by the fact that the two beings at the kitchen table had just mapped out the largest cover-up in human history. Marcus picked up his pen. I know some people, he said. Outside, gravel crunched slowly at the far end of the dirt road. Ranger's head came up immediately, 2 sets of headlights, moving without any hurry, rolling toward the house through the dark Colorado trees. Nova stood up fast. Her hand found the edge of the table. Every light beneath her skin blazed blue and sharp and bright. Marcus looked at the headlights, then at her. Back room, he said quietly. Now. Marcus moved fast, but quietly. He guided Nova to the back room, the one filled with old equipment, stacked radio parts, and shelves of technical manuals going back 30 years. He pulled a heavy workbench slightly away from the wall, just enough to create a space behind it. Stay here, he said. Do not make light. Nova understood immediately. She pressed herself into the gap behind the bench. pulled her knees to her chest, and focused on her breathing the way Marcus had seen her do before when she needed to control the glow. The blue faded slowly down to almost nothing. Ranger tried to follow her. "No," Marcus told him firmly, pointing to the kitchen floor. "Stay." Ranger looked at him, then at the back room, then back at Marcus with an expression of profound personal disagreement. But he stayed. Marcus walked to the front window and looked through the edge of the curtain without moving it. 2 black vehicles had stopped at the top of the dirt path, out about 40 meters from the house. No markings, no agency plates, the kind of clean, forgettable vehicles that were specifically designed to not be remembered. 4 figures stepped out, moving in the careful, measured way of people who were trained and expected no real resistance. Marcus had spent 20 years working alongside government contractors and private aerospace agencies. He knew what organized looked like. He also knew what overconfident looked like. He stepped away from the window, picked up his phone, and made 3 calls. The first call went to Howard Briggs. Howard was 71 years old, a retired Air Force ground mechanic who now lived 11 kilometers down the Valley Road and spent most of his time fixing engines that did not need fixing and building things that had no clear purpose. He and Marcus had met at a community radio event 6 years ago and had been trading technical opinions and bad coffee ever since. Marcus spoke for 45 seconds. Howard said nothing during those 45 seconds. Then he said, "Give me 20 minutes," and hung up. The second call went to Patricia Osei. Patricia was 67, a former NASA data analyst who had left the agency under circumstances she described only as a disagreement about what the data actually said. She lived in a converted farmhouse on the other side of the valley with 4 satellite dishes in her back field and a server setup that Marcus had always found impressive and slightly alarming. She listened to Marcus for a full minute without speaking. Then she said, "I have been waiting for a phone call like this for 11 years. What format is the data on?" Marcus described the chip as best he could. There was a short silence. Then Patricia said, "Bring it close to your old shortwave receiver. I can try to pull a signal remotely. Do not plug it into anything digital in your house." A pause. "How much time do we have?" Marcus looked toward the front of the house. "Not much." "Then stop talking to me and let me work." The third call went to Dennis Farrow. Dennis was 58, a former deep space communications engineer who had spent the last decade running what he called an independent radio astronomy project from a shed behind his house, and what most people called an obsession. He had 17 receiver units spread across a field and had once picked up a signal that 3 universities later confirmed was not from any known natural source. And the universities had then quietly stopped returning his calls. Dennis picked up on the first ring, which suggested he had been awake already. Marcus told him everything. There was a long silence on the line. Then Dennis said in a very calm voice, "I need you to understand that I am not surprised. I want you to know that. I am not even slightly surprised." Another pause. "I will start the broadcast array. Give me a frequency window." The 4 figures from the black vehicles reached the front porch 12 minutes after Marcus made his calls. They knocked. Polite, firm, official. Marcus opened the door. The one in front was a man, medium height, with a face that gave away nothing and eyes that were taking inventory of everything behind Marcus in a single sweep. He spoke in clean, unaccented English. And he said they were conducting a survey of unusual atmospheric activity in the valley and needed to ask a few routine questions. Marcus leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Sure," he said. "What do you want to know?" The questions were careful, indirect. They never mentioned anything specific. They talked about lights in the sky, unusual sounds, whether Marcus had noticed any strangers in the area recently. Marcus answered everything with the slow, mild patience of a man who had absolutely nothing interesting going on in his life. He mentioned his broken radio. He mentioned that Ranger had been unsettled by the storm last week. He mentioned that rural Colorado was generally very boring. The man watched him throughout with the steady attention of someone trained to find cracks. Marcus gave him none. And what Marcus did not mention was that while this conversation was happening, Patricia Osei was already pulling fragmented data from the chip through a remote shortwave connection, breaking it into 17 separate encrypted file packages. He did not mention that Dennis Farrow had activated his entire broadcast array and was preparing to push those packages simultaneously across multiple overlapping frequencies that could not be cleanly jammed without taking down half the valley's communication infrastructure. And he did not mention that Howard Briggs had driven his oldest and loudest truck to the narrow section of the access road 2 kilometers back and parked it sideways across both lanes with the engine off and the keys in his pocket. The 4 visitors would not be getting back to their vehicles quickly. And after 10 minutes, the man thanked Marcus politely and the group turned to leave. Marcus closed the door. He stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Patricia. 2 words. It's sending. He breathed out. Nova emerged from the back room quietly. She had heard everything through the thin wall. She stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Marcus with an expression that was difficult to read. "They will come back," she said. "With more." "I know," Marcus said. "Your people just broadcast pieces of the transmission across open frequencies." She paused. "The Conquered will know within hours." "Good," Marcus said simply. Nova stared at him. "You are not afraid?" Marcus thought about that honestly. "I am absolutely afraid," he said. "But afraid does not mean stopped." She was quiet for a moment. The blue light under her skin was still present but steadier now, not panicked, just alert. "On my world," she said carefully, "when a smaller group faces a much larger and more powerful force, the expected response is to wait, to be careful, to find a political solution through proper channels over a long period of time." Marcus picked up his cold coffee and looked at it. "How does that usually work out?" Nova considered this with complete seriousness. "Slowly," she said, "and often not in the smaller group's favor." Marcus nodded. "That is why we did not do that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Ranger, who was sitting by the back door, looking deeply pleased with the general energy in the room, even though he had no idea what was happening. "The Concord strategy," Nova said slowly, thinking through it as she spoke, "has always worked because it is built on one idea, that a smaller and less advanced group, when it sees a greater power, will hesitate. It will feel small. It will wait for permission." Marcus said. "You did not hesitate." "We had 70 hours, Marcus said. "Hesitating seemed like a poor use of the time." Nova almost smiled. "Their models do not account for this." "What models?" "The ones that predict how developing civilizations respond to pressure." She tilted her head slightly. "They are very detailed models. Thousands of years of data. They account for fear, for political division, for resource limitations." A pause. "They do not have a category for 3 retired engineers who are personally annoyed." Marcus set his coffee down. "That might be humanity's greatest weapon," he said. "And we get annoyed." Outside, far above the Colorado clouds, something changed. The large, dark vessel that had been holding its position shifted. It was no longer searching slowly. It was moving with purpose now, descending toward the valley in a way that did not care about being seen anymore. Ranger stood up. He walked to the back door, ears fully forward, tail still. Then came a knock. Not from a human hand. The sound was too measured, too evenly spaced, and whatever was making it was large enough that the impact traveled slightly through the floor. Marcus and Nova both looked at the door. Then they looked at each other. Ranger's tail began to wag. "An alien girl followed my dog home and changed our lives forever." Part 5. The dog knew. First, nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. The knock came again. Same rhythm, same measured spacing. Patient and calm, like whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world and was simply choosing to be polite about it. Ranger had not barked. He had not growled. He was standing at the back door with his ears forward and his tail moving in that slow, easy way that Marcus had learned over 10 years meant exactly one thing: not a threat. Marcus looked at Nova. Her silver eyes were fixed on the door. The blue light beneath her skin was moving fast, bright along her jaw and collarbone. But she had not stepped back. She was standing her ground, reading the situation with that sharp, careful attention she gave to everything. "Do you know what that is?" Marcus asked quietly. She stared at the door for another moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than that. Like a feeling she had not allowed herself to have in a very long time, was carefully considering whether it was safe to exist. "Open it," she said. Marcus crossed the kitchen. He put his hand on the latch. He paused for just 1 second, not from fear but from the simple human awareness that whatever was on the other side of this door, life would not be the same after he saw it. He opened the door. The figure standing on the back porch was tall, not enormously tall. Perhaps 2 heads above Marcus, which was enough. The build was lean and composed, wrapped in a dark fitted covering that was clearly not fabric in any way Marcus understood. It moved slightly with its own quiet energy, like it was breathing. The face was Valeth, the same sharp, delicate bone structure as Nova, the same silver eyes, but older, much older. And the kind of face that had seen enough that it no longer reacted quickly to anything. He stood completely still and looked at Marcus with those silver eyes for a steady moment. Then he looked past Marcus into the kitchen. When he saw Nova, something moved across his face. It was small and quickly controlled, but Marcus caught it clearly. It was the expression of someone who had been looking for something important for a very long time, and had just found it. Nova made a sound. A short, sharp harmonic in her own language, barely above a whisper. The tall figure responded in the same language, low and even. 3 short tones. Then Ranger walked forward, sniffed the visitor's hand with great thoroughness, and wagged his tail twice. The tall figure looked down at the dog. He stayed looking at him for longer than seemed necessary, and something about his expression shifted in a way that was hard to name. Like a man encountering something small that had unexpectedly rearranged a belief he had held for decades. When he looked back up at Marcus, he spoke in perfect, clear English. "Your animal accepted her," he said. "That is why she survived. I have studied your species for 30 years, and I did not predict that." His name was Kalen. He was Nova's mentor from the expedition, the only adult supervisor who had made it out. He had spent weeks tracking her emergency pod signal across the solar system, moving carefully and quietly, avoiding the same Concord agents who had come looking in the valley. He came alone. He came without weapons. And he came, as he explained while sitting at Marcus's kitchen table with a cup of water he did not drink but held with both hands. Because the situation had changed significantly in the last several hours. Patricia's broadcast had worked. The 17 encrypted packages were moving across frequencies that covered an enormous range. They could not be fully recalled. Some had already reached the kind of deep space relay points that fed into communication networks far beyond Concord-controlled channels. Scientists and researchers and independent observers across multiple star systems were beginning to receive fragmented pieces of something that did not fit any official record. The quieting was no longer a secret held by a few powerful officials. It was a signal that was still spreading. Kalen explained all of this in the measured, careful way of someone who chose every word with purpose. He told Marcus that within the Concord there had always been a faction that opposed the quieting. Older voices, quieter ones. People who believed that controlling a developing civilization was not only wrong, but deeply dangerous. That it corrupted the Concord itself, slowly and from the inside. Those voices had never had evidence. They had never had names. Now they had both. "What happens next?" Marcus asked. Kalen set down the water cup. "The Concord will not collapse tonight. These things move slowly even when the pressure is enormous. There will be formal challenges, investigations, political processes that will take years." He paused. "But the operation ends. It ends because it cannot survive being seen. And the people who ran it cannot survive the names on that chip becoming public record." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "And Earth?" Kalen looked at him steadily. "Earth will not receive an invitation to the Concord. Not tonight, not next year. Perhaps not for a generation." He said it plainly, without apology. "Your world is not ready for that conversation. Truthfully, neither is the Concord. There is too much history to undo too quickly." Marcus nodded slowly. He had expected that answer. He found that it did not bother him as much as he thought it would. "But the sabotage stops," he said. "Yes," Kalen said. "The sabotage stops. And our research moves freely." "Yes." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Then that is enough," he said. "For now." Kalen looked at him for a moment with an expression that was as close to respect as his composed face seemed to allow. Nova said goodbye to Marcus just before dawn. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her silver suit repaired. Kalen had brought a small device that had sealed the tears and burns in under a minute, and her dark hair dried and neat. She looked like herself again. Whatever herself truly was. She had her notebook tucked under one arm, the one she had filled with English words and drawings of Ranger from 17 different angles. Marcus stood by the counter with his hands in his pockets. He did not know what to say. That happened to him sometimes with things that mattered too much. Nova crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of Ranger. She knelt down. She held his face in both hands, her four-fingered hands gentle and careful against his gray muzzle. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. And then she spoke to him in her own language, soft and low and full of tones that Marcus could feel but not understand. She spoke for almost a full minute. Ranger listened to every word with his brown eyes half closed and his tail moving slow and steady. When she finished, she pressed her forehead very gently against the top of his head. Just for a second. Then she stood up and looked at Marcus. "Thank you," she said. It was simple and direct, and carried the full weight of everything the words contained. Marcus nodded once. "Take care of yourself out there." She almost said something more. He could see it in her expression, something larger that was looking for a way out. But she held it, the way someone holds something precious because they are not sure the moment is strong enough to carry it. No, she turned and walked out the back door into the pale early morning. Kalen paused at the door frame and looked back at Marcus one final time. "You were not supposed to matter yet," he said, not unkindly, almost with something that might have been wonder underneath the composure. "Your civilization, your timeline, none of the models placed you here, doing this for at least another 100 years. Marcus looked at Ranger, who had sat down by the door and was watching Nova walk toward the dark tree line where Kalen's vessel was hidden. Ranger had other plans, Marcus said. Kalen looked at the dog one more time. Then he stepped off the porch and walked into the morning without another word. Marcus stood on the back porch for a long time after they were gone. The Colorado sky was turning from black to deep blue at the edges, yet the kind of color that only existed for about 10 minutes before the real light arrived. The pine trees were still, and the valley was completely quiet, and somewhere above the clouds, something enormous was rising slowly and silently away from the earth. He watched the sky until it was fully light. Then he went inside, put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table with a fresh notepad. He wrote the date at the top. He thought for a moment. Then he began writing everything down from the beginning. The rain, the porch steps, the silver eyes, the data chip, Howard blocking the road, Patricia's broadcast, Kaylin's perfect English, the conversation at this very table. All of it, every detail he could hold. He was not sure who he was writing it for. Maybe nobody, maybe everyone. And maybe just for the version of himself that might need reminding someday that the quiet life he had been drifting through had cracked open one rainy Thursday night and turned into something that mattered. Somewhere across the valley, in a converted farmhouse surrounded by satellite dishes, Patricia Osei was watching 17 signal threads still moving outward through space, carrying pieces of a truth that could no longer be called back. Somewhere down the road, Howard Briggs had finally moved his truck and was driving home with the window down and a large, satisfied smile on his face. Somewhere in a shed full of receiver units, Dennis Farrow was listening to the quiet that followed the broadcast and feeling, for the first time in 11 years, that the silence finally made sense. And at a deep space research station on the other side of the planet, a young engineer named Sana Mirza sat down at her desk at 7 in the morning, opened her computer, and found an anonymous encrypted file sitting in an obscure channel she barely checked anymore. She almost deleted it. Something made her open it instead. She began reading. After 4 minutes, she stopped. She sat completely still. Then she pulled up the propulsion model she had been struggling with for 6 years and started working with a focus she had never quite found before. She did not know where the file came from. She did not know what had happened in a small house in a Colorado valley the night before. She only knew that something had opened up that had been closed for a very long time. Back in the kitchen, Ranger finished his breakfast. Though walked to the patch of morning sunlight coming through the window, turned 2 circles, and lay down. He closed his eyes. His tail moved once, slowly, contentedly. The job was done. End.